The book of 1 Corinthians is one of the outstanding letters that Paul wrote. It's one of the most severe letter, perhaps the most severe letter that he wrote to any of the churches. The church at Corinth was a unique congregation. It was established by Paul somewhere in about AD 50 or 51, and then later he wrote letters to this church. The church was in a city that had a great deal of problems. One of the writers, in commenting on the book of 1 Corinthians, said that all of the wicked, terrible things of the Roman Empire were in a microcosm right there in the city of Corinth. So the city of Corinth had a bad reputation. There was a time when a woman who came from Corinth was referred to as just a Corinthian girl, and that generally meant that she was a very immoral person. The city of Corinth was right close to a seaport, and it was pretty much a town for the sailors, you know. And this also added to the terrible things, the reputation that the city of Corinth had. It was one of the larger cities in the country of Greece. It's located about 75 miles west of Athens. It's right close to the coast, and as I said, this lent something to the corruption that was in the city of Corinth. Well, religion, so far as religion is concerned, the people of Corinth had a number of gods. The god Poseidon was the main god. This was the god the Romans called Neptune. The god Poseidon, and then they had, and there still is the ruins of the old temple of Apollos. Apollo, not Apollos. The old temple of Apollo was there in Corinth, and the columns from that temple are still standing in the city. It's one of the photographic opportunities that you get when you go to the city of Corinth to take a picture of the beautiful columns there of the temple of Apollo. And then also there was the goddess Aphrodite, who was worshipped by the Corinthian people. Now, in addition to that, of course, there was the Jewish religion in the city. Claudius, the emperor, had chased all of the Jews out of the city of Rome. And some of these Jews went and settled in the city of Corinth, and they established a synagogue there. There is a large stone about this big, and about that high, and it is inscribed the synagogue of the Jews, and it dates back to this dates back to the time when Paul was there. Now the Bible, the book of Acts, talks about the synagogue and the fact that one of the members of the church there lived next to the synagogue. And so there are a number of different interesting things about the city of Corinth. In the museum at the city of Corinth, there are all kinds of body parts made of clay, legs and arms, internal body parts, and all of this sort of thing. And you wonder, well, what are all of these about? What are all of these for? Well, there's something very interesting about them, because the people of ancient Corinth believed that when a part of the body was ailing or it was diseased, they thought that if they made a clay mold of it and offered that clay mold to the god, that would induce the god to heal that part of the body. And so the museum has all of these body parts made of clay that have been offered to the god. So it's a very interesting place. When I was thinking about the sermons for the next few weeks, I thought, well, I believe that I will take the book of 1 Corinthians and the Corinthian correspondence, really, it's more than just 1 Corinthians, and just talk about some of the things that are there in this book. Now, Corinth was it was a philosophical center. Not like Athens, but the fact that it was fairly close to Athens there, a lot of the characteristics of Athens also took shape over there in Corinth. And so when Paul opens the book of 1 Corinthians, after he has given his salutation in the 10th verse of chapter 1, he begins by saying, I appeal to you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another so that there are no divisions among you. That you may be perfectly united in mind and in thought. My brothers from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you, and this is what I mean. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. And still another, I follow Cephas, and another, I follow Christ. Well, we think in terms primarily of divisions within the church there in Corinth. It's a little bit more than this, and you see this as Paul develops it through the first 4 chapters of this book. He asks the question, well, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? And then he says, I'm glad I didn't baptize any more of you than I did. Otherwise, people may be calling themselves by my name. Well, like I said, there's a little bit more to it than just divisions within the church and what we call sometimes preacheritis, where there's great loyalty to a preacher. Notice that Paul had been there. Later, Apollos came, and Peter came, Cephas. So, Apollos was a Jew who had left Rome, and these different ones had their followers. Why would that particular thing be characteristic of the city of Corinth? Well, there's a good reason for it, and Paul develops that as we go along. And this is where the title to the sermon tonight comes from. The foolishness of God versus the wisdom of men. Because you see, the philosophers were in some competition with each other, and they argued with each other and debated one another and all of this sort of thing. And one would say, I'm a follower of Aristotle. Well, I'm a follower of Demosthenes. I'm a follower of Plato. I'm a follower of this one or the other one, And so it was very natural for the people in Corinth early on to say, oh, I follow Paul. Paul is the one who brought the gospel to me. Here, Apollos brought the gospel to another group. And so they thought of themselves as followers of these different men because that's the way the philosophers did. They had the followers of these various philosophical schools. And so Paul devotes the first 4 chapters of the book to try and tell these people, look, I didn't come as a philosopher. I didn't come even as a theologian. I came simply as a representative of Christ. And so after he has said this about his Christ divided, I'm glad I didn't baptize any of you more than I did. Otherwise, someone would say that he was a follower of me. But in the 17th verse, it says, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of human wisdom. This would really touch a very sensitive chord in the minds of these Corinthian people. Because this is exactly the way they were thinking of the gospel in reference to philosophy. And so philosophy was based on human wisdom. A philosopher would come up with his theories about a wide variety of things and how people should live and what's the meaning of life and all this sort of thing. And now this messenger from Christ comes up and he says, well, here's the meaning of life and here's the way you should behave and so forth. And so some of them took it that this really is a religious philosophy. And so Paul said, wait a minute, you're misunderstanding this whole thing. And so he says, I did not come with words of wisdom, of human wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. Now that's going to be a main theme for Paul as he goes along in this first 4 chapters in particular. In verse 18 he says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent will be frustrated. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Now, Paul is going to use this in I think we can say a sarcastic way. Paul was a good man with sarcasm sometimes. And so he says, where's the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him. God was pleased through the foolishness of what is preached to save them who believe. Jews demand a miraculous sign. The Greeks looked for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, the stumbling block to the Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Let's pause for a moment here because this strikes such a very important note in this book of 1 Corinthians, particularly, as I said, the first 4 chapters. You see, the Jews had, one of the big troubles that the Jews had was that, first of all, God doesn't have a son. They never did believe in that. Jews today don't believe in a Trinity at all. And so that was a stumbling block to the Jews. And then besides that, their Messiah was crucified. Completely different from their concept of what the Messiah was going to be. And so to the Jews, this whole thing of the gospel was just a stumbling block. Now, what about the Greeks? Well, the Greeks didn't so much have an idea of sin and forgiveness. Philosophy doesn't really deal with that. It deals with how we live, the nature of man's mental activity and things like this. And the philosopher deals with things that have to do with our origin and our mission in life and how we should live, ethics and this sort of thing. But it's all based on human wisdom. And so Paul says, you know, the idea that a man came and lived for 33 years and was crucified, that is stupid. That was their idea. That is stupid. That is foolish. It doesn't stand to reason. And so Paul says, to the Greeks, this whole thing is foolishness. But to people who accept sin, people who accept forgiveness, people who accept the concept of atonement, this represents the power of God and the real wisdom of God. Now, you notice earlier that he has said, the world through its wisdom did not know God. Let me tell you something, folks. God does not stand at the end of a line of syllogistic reasoning. That's not where God is. You cannot come to a conclusion that the Bible is the Word of God by some kind of logical sequence of thoughts. And so what Paul is saying is that we have to see sin, we have to see the importance of forgiveness, and we have to see our incapability to forgive ourselves. And so, but the Greeks couldn't understand that. This doesn't stand to reason. This is a lot of baloney, so far as they were concerned. And the Jews, a dead Messiah, a crucified Messiah? No, that didn't fit. But he says, people who see this in the context of the gospel story, this is the power of God, and it's the wisdom of God, not of man. And so then he uses the statement that really I got the title of the sermon from. In verse 25, for the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Do you see what Paul is doing? He is saying, God, I guess we could probably put it this way: God, at his most foolish moment, is far and away wiser than man at man's wisest moment. And so he uses this contrast, the foolishness of God versus the wisdom of men. They don't even come out in the same ballpark. They don't even compare with each other. And this is Paul's way of enforcing that idea that God's plan of salvation, God's gospel, it doesn't stand to reason. Now stop and think about that. The gospel is I didn't say unreasonable. The gospel is non-reasonable. That is, it doesn't come up as a result of your own thinking. Now, that's really important in our world today because science is everything, isn't it? Science can solve all of the problems of life. Science can tell us where the world came from. Science can tell us that the cosmos was never a product of any design or anything like this, and that there is no God. And by the way, did you know that there is a movement underway in our country in the fairly near future, to have an atheist run for president of the United States on the basis of he's an atheist? That's how strong this is coming in our own country. I saw this last night or night before on the TV in an interview program where they were talking about this, and this was a very, very probable thing in the minds of the people who were being interviewed. Well, Paul says that's not what the gospel is about. The gospel, instead, is about the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, in verse 27, Paul says, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise." When I was preparing this lesson, I thought to myself, every once in a while when I go in to take a shower, there'll be a little bitty spider. A little bitty spider. You know, one of these long-legged spiders that has a body that's about the size of 2 pinheads, and that's about all. And I stopped and thought about that spider, and I said to myself, he's got some kind of nervous system. He's got some kind of brain, because he's scared when I jostle things around a little bit. He knows enough to try and get out of the way. I usually catch him. But the whole idea is that here is something that, oh my, the iPhone, the computer, all of these great gadgets that we have, and they put so much information on such a little bitty chip, and we think, oh, that's just great. Think about the information in that little spider. He knows something. I don't know what he knows, but he knows something. And so Paul says here, God chose the foolish things to confound the wise. God chose the weak things to shame those who are strong. He chose the lowly things and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one could boast before him. Oh, I think I'm so smart. I understand physics. I understand chemistry. I understand all the sciences. I understand astronomy. I understand, all of the theories that have come up about how the cosmos was formed, the Big Bang Theory, and just the whole works. I understand all of that stuff. And I am just very, very smart. And Paul says, compared to an infinite God, compared to a God who has all knowledge, who has all power, that's not even a bump in the road. And that's Paul. That's Paul's approach to this whole thing. Then in the second chapter, he says, "When I came to you, I didn't come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed the testimony of God. I was resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." Folks, when we get away from the simple message of Christ and we begin emphasizing the philosophies of our day and the psychology of our day and the sociology of our day and all of the trends of our day, and we forget about the power of the cross, we're dead. This is one of the problems of 21st century mankind, is we've got all the answers. We know all that we need to know. We can understand all that we need to understand. And Paul says, the problem with that is that you don't understand what the real problem of mankind is. What is it? It's sin. And it's only through the power of God that this can be overcome. Well, again, it's kind of foolish sounding, isn't it? 2,000 years ago or so, a man over in a remote country who was born in a stable and grew up in an obscure village, and now he dies on a cross, and everybody says, now we can be forgiven. No, that doesn't make any sense. And that's Paul's message. No, it doesn't make sense. But that's not what it's about, making sense. What it is about is this, that's the power of God and the wisdom of God, as Paul says. And so the book of 1 Corinthians begins with its first 4 chapters in developing this idea. So when the divisions that were there in the church, when they began coming out, it was much more than just people fussing among themselves saying, I like this preacher, I like this preacher, and I like this preacher. It's much more than that. And it's something that is very present with us today, because academia is really the thing that's being emphasized in reference to religion today. And this is the big thing that Christian people, why the atheists object to Christian people, is because it makes no sense to them. And their ultimate tribunal, their ultimate a jury is the whole idea that if I can't understand the why, I can't accept it. My answer to that is simple. I have 2 computers at home. I don't have any idea how either one of them works. Now, Rudy understands how they work. I don't understand. I know when I push certain buttons, certain things happen. And sometimes I push the wrong button and the wrong thing happens. But I am constantly faced with the fact that I use things, I accept things, I have no problem with things that I don't understand at all. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody doesn't understand it. Yeah, Rudy understands my computer. But you see, when we're dealing with the ultimate things of the universe and, of the complicated things of the universe, we have to see an ultimate source for that. And that's God. And so Paul says, no, it doesn't stand at the end of a syllogism. It's something that we experience as the power of God, and we see something around us that is absolutely inexplicable. And that is that there has to be a designer for all of the things that are present with us. And so Paul says you will never arrive at faith just by reason. You arrive at faith because of what you see in the power of God that's all around us. We're going to begin next time, next Sunday evening. We're going to begin with the 5th chapter, and we'll see something about the internal problems of the Corinthian church. The first 4 chapters deal with the problem of human wisdom and the gospel. And then from chapter 5 through chapter 14, through chapter 15, he's going to deal with the internal problems of the church. And it's like a friend of mine said one time, I'm so glad that the church at Corinth was such a corrupt church, because in the book of 1 Corinthians, as Paul was writing to correct some of these problems, in this book of 1 Corinthians, we have Paul dealing with so many things that are contemporary with us. And in the providence of God, God used the error and the corruption and the sins of the people of Corinth to tell us something about how we really ought to live. We're going to sing an invitation song. If you are in need to respond to the invitation of Christ, this is the time. Let's stand together.